Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today. We're going to give everybody a chance to get connected, and we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today for the Arboro Cloud Migration Webinar Series. My name is Althea Barkley and I'm the Marketing Communications Manager, and we are so glad that you've taken the time to spend this session with us. Arboro Solution is uniquely positioned to provide complete end-to-end solutions. This empowers customers to receive maximum benefits from their iManage investment. Using best practice and unrivaled products and services, Arboro enables our clients' onboarding, adoption, and continued success. As a premier iManage partner, Arboro brings the credibility of a seasoned organization that has consistently delivered excellence to all aspects of our partnerships. Arboro is a certified global iManage partner, which encompasses Arboro as an iManage reseller, integration partner, technology partner, and training partner for iManage. This extensive partnership makes Arboro uniquely qualified to provide for all of our customers' iManage related needs. It also demonstrates our ability to meet the challenges and opportunities that are before our customers head on. Through our training and strategic services offerings, we help our clients to make great decisions and support them through the process of implementing the iManage solutions. So today's is the first of the three webinars in the series. We're going to be talking about cloud migration, the top 5 imperatives. So just to give a little housekeeping, we will be sending out a recording. We would like you to submit your questions at any time during the presentation. Please use the question panel, and we will be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentation. And also, we are very grateful if you can please complete the survey at the end as well. So we're going to be, I'll introduce our presenters, and then we'll do a general considerations. We'll talk about the top 5 imperatives, and then we'll do the pre-flight checklist, and then we'll do a Q&A. So today our presenters are John LaReverend, who is the Sales Solutions Consultant at Arboro, and Arthi Logus Warren, who is a Technical Consultant. John has empowered Arboro clients to be more productive and efficient for over 12 years. With a wealth of experience in legal technology and extensive knowledge of the challenges professional services firms face, he analyzes and recommends the best suited solutions. Arthi has spent a great deal of time working firsthand with partners and clients to ensure successful cloud migrations. Using her technical background, she strives to simplify the process involved during cloud implementations. And now I'll turn it over to John.
Great, thanks, Althea. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So we're going to start off with some general considerations. Probably seen this quote before from Benjamin Franklin, but I think that it really comes in handy when you're looking at going to the cloud, because there's some key things you need to keep in mind. So by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. So that's generally what we're looking at here, is all the things you can do in advance of a cloud migration to help that actual process go a lot smoother. So that's what this first webinar is going to be concerned with, those items that you can look at when you're first initially scoping what it might look like to do a cloud migration. This would apply for firms who are already on iManage on-prem and looking to the cloud. It also has a lot of implications for firms who are just looking at going directly to the iManage cloud. We'll focus on if you're coming from another DMS in our third iManage cloud series. The second one, we're going to look at actually what it's going to be like to taking your data and moving to the cloud and all those considerations of what it looks like and how to go live and things like that. So this one is more the task you'd look at first. Some firms have already made the decision, yes, we're going to the cloud, it's happening now, or it's 2 years out. Other firms have been tasked with looking at what it means to go to the cloud. And some people have been tasked with looking at the specific needs of the firm and how they can be met by cloud. So generally, looking at the big picture of how it all comes together, a lot of considerations to look at putting into the plan. The actual data movement itself is one piece, and we have several items we're going to discuss during that, but also looking at the overall plan of how it's going to come together. There is some new considerations when you are putting your content in the iManage cloud in terms of the actual client itself and some new tools that become available with your cloud subscription. So that's one of the key differences there, I guess, is looking at what's available now. If you're on-prem, you had to purchase the different components a la carte. So depending on if you wanted certain features or certain functions, you had to buy them. With cloud, there is 3 tiers available, and each of them has different features that come along with it. And a lot of them are in addition to what you might have available now. So it's looking at how those new features fit in and whether you want to roll them out right away or you want to look at phasing them in after you've gone live. So we'll go through some general considerations, looking at how that's going to come together. Then I'm going to go through the top 5 imperatives, and then we're going to turn it over to my colleague Arthi, who has worked on and is our lead on a lot of cloud implementations that we're doing right now, and she's going to share some stories with you and some different tasks for how to actually get there correctly. So before we jump into this, let's do a quick poll just to see what everybody is thinking. And I have a couple of questions that we prepared here to see the biggest obstacle you envision in migrating your DMS to the cloud. So let's launch that up here. So if everybody can take a second to go through and click on one of those items there. If there's other items that aren't in the list, we kind of picked what we thought would be the top 4, and you want to have a question about that, you can enter that into the question section. So I got 67% have voted so far. Let's see if we can get a little bit higher, then I'll close it out and get the results for you here. And just a few more seconds and we'll close it out. Okay, so looking at the results from that, let's share those out here. So looking at the results, 41% think that preparing the data is the biggest obstacle. Cost is second. Then tied for third and fourth is security and impact on end users. So I think these are all considerations that need to be thought about when you're going through this. But the big part here, it's good to see that preparing the data is a big concern, because that is something that we find a lot of firms are surprised about when we go through and show them. There's a lot of work that we try to do ahead of time before we actually start, moving the data physically to the cloud, because we can find out that there's a lot of things you can do to reduce a lot of risk and a lot of errors that come up, because we know exactly what's iManaged Cloud is expecting, and we can head those off before we actually get there. So let's move on to quick second poll here. So the biggest challenges to performing the cleanup. So we have a couple options here: finding staff who can do the cleanup, user impacts to cleanup, which could sometimes come down to staffing. Not knowing what to clean up is a key part of it as well. There are a number of different items. And then understanding, if you know what to clean up, how to go about doing that. Still getting a few coming in here. We're at 64%. Just give another couple seconds here. Okay, I think we're good with this one. Let's close that part off. I'll share out some of these results. So overall, we're seeing, I'll go in order of popularity here, understanding what to clean up. You might have had a similar question when you were first going to iManage, when you had all this content and you were told, well, if it's nice and neat and clean, it'll go into iManage really easily. But getting it there, that's sometimes the hard part. So understanding is a key part. So that's number one. Tied for second is finding staff who can do the cleanup and not knowing what to clean up. And then third, the user impacts, which sometimes means, do you ask billable staff to assist with cleanup? And there's always a cost associated with that as well. So we'll go through and we'll try to address these items here to see who and how can you best prepare your data to get it to go into the cloud for a smooth transition. So let's skip on back to now, top 5 imperatives. So 5 key things that we're going to look at and cover for how you can prepare yourself best to ensure a smooth transition to the cloud. So managing expectations is the first part. I'll cover some technical and non-technical considerations to think about. It's a big change for firms, and there's a lot of different ways to go about it and new technologies that are available. So we'll talk about all those items and how you can make sure that you have the right idea in mind and that you don't have something that's unrealistic in terms of how you're going to get there or how long it's going to take. Security model impacts is a key thing. There are some changes to the cloud security where some of the old types of security models are no longer valid. So you have to figure out how your data fits into the one of the new models for the cloud. And then looking at and other types of security, whether you're looking at ethical walls, maybe changing your security model from open or public to need to know. A lot of these things are big themes that a lot of firms are looking at now with the advent of a lot of security leaks and things like that. And that's the other side of it is it more about protecting your data from outsiders getting access to things, or is it more insider risk for people knowingly or unknowingly sharing data? Then into integration and reporting. Differences in the reality of having hosted file store and database. That's something that is a challenge for a lot of firms that are used to having direct access to the file store and to SQL to do things. So there's finding new ways to have those type of functions still work to be able to support your users. Authentication methods. Key thing we're talking about is trusted login and how that's not something that is working in the cloud by design. So looking at how that's going to come into play, what some options are, and then looking at extending that access beyond, from behind a VPN or from in your office directly to opening it up to other devices as well. And the last part we'll talk about is knowing your data. This is a key part that we're going to see that there's a lot of issues that get introduced into databases and file stores over the years that we look at identifying what those are, because they're going to basically be put under a microscope when you move to the cloud. Everything gets revalidated. So we'll talk about what some of the things are that we can look for to allow for a smooth transition, to get rid of some of those issues before you even start moving them. Let's dig into this a little bit then. So getting into managing expectations. So impacting to the staff. That's a key thing to look at. And this can be managed a number of ways. When we start talking to clients about moving to the cloud, and depending on whatever version they're on now, you see a lot of differences. Some firms are not on Work 10 desktop, the latest iManage work platform that is cloud-based, Work 10 compatible, basically taking that step beyond file site and desk site. So looking at whether you need to change that when you go to the cloud. The usual answer is no, you don't have to change it, but you might want to look at introducing that. So it's again, coming towards that plan and seeing as you're going to the cloud, you also want to change the user interface to give them that more a refreshed feel. And that comes back to your reasons for going to the cloud in the first place, is that the users are looking for a change, they want to have a better experience, or is it more on the back end side where you're trying to make some efficiencies and you're not really looking at managing that on-prem anymore? There's a number of reasons, and you've all gone through that, which is probably why you're here today. So we won't dig too deep into that part. But then just looking at, is this going to happen right at the same time as you move your content to the cloud, or do you want to get your data in the cloud first, keep the user interface exactly the same as it is now, and then maybe as a phase 2 approach, start looking at different interfaces. So looking at, introducing the work web panel, and then maybe going into a hybrid mode where you'd have some people using the work web while still using your same integration into Office. And then there's a different model that they've brought in there where it's you're doing a hybrid approach where you can still keep file site and desk site, but when you look at your Office integration, it's now using the new method, so the Work 10 desktop. So you're going to see when you're opening and saving in Word, you're now going to see the new interface for iManage. That's a little more cleaner of a design, web-based interfaces. So there's different ways to go through that. And that's not always a simple answer, is to determine, what happens right now, unless you've been tasked with absolutely no changes to your user desktop, just get the data in the cloud, that works as well. So that's just a conversation to have to determine what happens with your actual client version. There are some constraints around that. If you are on a really old version, you may need to look at updating that to a somewhat newer version. There is some version compatibility there. I think most firms now are on version 9 or better. There is the odd one that's still on previous versions for their own reasons. So just looking at that, typically we look at being at least at server version 9 before being able to move to the cloud directly without looking at some kind of midterm upgrade. So then looking at timelines. Having a realistic timeline. So thinking that this is, everything's working great now, let's just make a copy in the cloud and turn it on and go live. And how hard can it be? That's the type of thinking that is going to really throw a wrench in the works. It does take a little bit of time to go ahead and prepare before you actually want to do this. And what it works out to is you either fix it now or fix it right, you're in the middle of the migration, and there's a lot of stress and timing around getting it up and running as fast as possible. So what we've seen in terms of timelines from the time the project starts and people are engaged and looking at doing the actual work to plan it out, best case is probably around 3 months from when you actually do your kickoff meeting to your go live date. It really will depend on the size of the firm as well. For firms that are larger, that have many databases, many locations, that's something that will play into this as well. It could take longer amount of times. For very large firms that have international presence, they may want to do a phased rollout, library by library. It is when you actually start moving the content to the cloud, that's how it's typically done. You can go big bang and have, if you have 3 or 4 libraries, they can all be done at once. But if you have a lot larger number, that may be something where you want to do it region by region. So just keeping in mind the timelines there. And when you see what we're going to look at for the cleanup, some of that will determine how long or when you want to start. If there are certain things that you need to look at before you even kick things off to start looking at the data, we'll provide some details on that, and maybe you can determine how long that would take internally before you actually get engaged in moving the data. So then moving into disaster recovery and failover. This is something where, depending on, again, the size of the firm, you may have various different plans, and how iManage fits into that plan is going to change quite a bit when you move that to the cloud. So before, if you had to maintain 2 different sets of servers, I don't think this was the majority of firms have a fully hot swappable environment with indexing, database, and files ready to go in the event that there's some issue with your live environment that you can fail over or have some high availability option to swap that over. So then looking at what that changes in the cloud, given that you're now having your primary data center and a secondary data center, and then managing what happens and when you would fail over from one to the other. So it's testing that and how that fits into your general plan for how you're managing disasters. It does open up some new opportunities where if you're no longer able to work out of your office, that site, whether there's power issues, networking issues, things like that, it does afford people to, just like now, as most of you are probably viewing this from home, opening up this directly so that you can connect directly to the cloud. We'll talk a little bit about VPN and whether that's something that you want to require before connecting. And then there's an impact on the different devices that you can use as well. So while the cloud is available through the public internet, some firms really want to lock that down and be secure and still require you to authenticate through single sign-on or some other method to make sure that you're going through the company network before you get to your data in the cloud. So that's all part of the consideration here as well. And then training. Training is the last piece that comes back to the first part that we looked at. Usually that's tied to what you're doing and changing on the user desktops. If you are going to be implementing a new client, whether it's just upgrading from an older version of FileSite or DeskSite to the latest one to make sure that it's compatible, or if you are moving to the Work 10 desktop, you can see that there's probably some type of training required just so that users know what's coming, and that can take various forms. In some cases, just letting them know along the way that there's kind of trickle the information out to them, let them know that we're introducing this new web panel, here's how it's going to work, here's where you can use it, if that's available only to certain types of staff that are frequently traveling. Those are probably going to be a lot more reduced now unless some of that changes really soon. And then being able to get them up to speed on what they're expecting. So that's coming back to the full implementation of a Work 10 client, staying exactly as things are. You probably wouldn't need a whole lot of training, or that piece in the middle where you're doing the hybrid experience, where you're introducing the features but not taking anything away that they're used to. So overall, the other part is, so you are looking at being able to test out the cloud, having some success criteria. So there's 2 levels to that. There's the IT type of success criteria where there's a lot of scrutiny over when I open a document from the cloud, will I notice? Will the end users even notice if we go and take their files, take them out of our office and put them into the iManage cloud? So that's looking at your expectation as well. Do you expect there to be 0 difference? So if I open a 10 meg document on-prem, it takes 20 seconds. In the cloud, I'm expecting the same thing. So it's figuring out what that acceptance criteria is. iManage has some of that available to say what their level of service is and what their timelines are for downloading and uploading content. So just being able to make sure to check that to make sure it's falling in line with what your expectations are. Then support as well. So your own support staff, with a lot of them have likely full NRT admin access now and different tools available to them to be able to support this. some of that support is now probably going to go to iManage. So if your indexer is down or things like that, where there's degradation of services, you won't have the ability to start and stop individual server-side tasks and activities. So that's something now that would be hopefully going down quite a bit in terms of frequency that you're going to see types of issues. So that's because the iManage team has monitoring in place for all the services, so they'll know right away if your indexer is down. They'll have something monitoring that, and they'll be able to start looking into the issue and resolve it, hopefully before you even notice an issue. But in terms of receiving requests from your users and being able to make changes, that's where we're going to be able to look at what new tools are available for accessing your content in the cloud. If you haven't been using Work 10 server at all, the Control Center is a web-based platform that you can see a lot of information into. It replaces a lot of the legacy tools from iManage, like database admin and things like that, where you can now do a lot of things through a web control panel. So those are the new things that we'll talk about coming up in later sessions here. So actually looking at the cloud architecture itself, we'll get into integration for firms that are a little apprehensive about moving to the cloud. Some have found that as much as your data, there is some fear of moving it there. Some are already actually there. If you think about your exchange, if sometimes you have a hosted exchange, there's probably some part of your organization that already is in the cloud, and we found that just understanding that will help people who are going through how that's going to come together. So that's all about managing expectations. Let's move on to the security model impacts. So here, there's a change that we've seen with the security model from iManage, where the optimistic and pessimistic types, where basically if you did have access to something through a group, but individually your name had some different level of access, that's how it would look at. Generally, if you have differing access to content, either it's whether a workspace, a folder, or a document, you would use typically whether it would give you permission or not, optimistic or pessimistic. The new model for the cloud is hybrid. So basically it is optimistic with the ability to deny. So if I have access to something from a group, but somebody has specifically said, no, this my ID has no access, that's ultimately what's going to prevent me access from that. So it seems to be a lot more in line with what you'd expect. So I'm just because I'm in some group that has access to something, but somebody has specifically said, no, you can't see that, I don't somehow get access to it. So it's just looking at that initially and doing a content security review of all your content to see if that's going to work. So how that's going to look through, and if there's things you have to do to adjust your groups. There's some interesting things that I've seen firms do overall. Some have just public access to things. I've seen some firms have groups set up with everyone in it, and they will assign that group to certain things. So there's just different ways to analyze your data to see, is that going to now work with this hybrid access in the cloud? So then looking at different things like ethical walls. So there's new pieces that come into play, and some of this comes into the next section, which is going to be dealing with integrations. So if you have third-party integrations, we'll cover that next, but just generally looking at your security overall. And a lot of firms look at now, especially given that there's more risk in your data and one person being able to access all of your data in your firm, they are looking at segregating data, at least by department. So that need to know security is something that a lot of firms are looking at as well. And when you go to the cloud, there's ways that you can apply those types of policies coming in, whether you want to do it on a template level for when your workspaces, or if you want to look at some of the new tools from iManage like Security Policy Manager. Some firms may have been interested in this product, but they had to be on the latest version of the iManage server and able to be to implement it. So now that they're going to the cloud and you get automatic upgrades, that piece may now be something that you should consider. The big difference that I've seen with comparing it to other ethical wall solutions it's directly applied. So if I make a change to the security to make a workspace from public to private. And as soon as I hit save, that's applied. There's no refiling required. So there's a big advantage that iManage has in being able to kind of supersede the actual access control list and be able to apply changes right away. So that's a big thing to look at is, do you need to look at your ethical walls of how those are being applied now, or possibly your conflicts, and see what that might change and what that might look like in the cloud. Then we mentioned this briefly before, the new security paradigm. So we have all this content that's available. It's available through the web. Possibly you can access it anywhere in the world. You might not need to go through VPN. So it does open up the data, and for good and for bad, possibly. So for good is wherever you are, whatever you're doing, if you're sitting in your home right now, you can easily access your data because the cloud connection is secure directly to it. But you also have the possibility of introducing some risk. So because everybody can access everything, if you haven't got things locked down to a great degree, there is the risk of some of that content gets shared out or possibly exposed. So looking at new options for analyzing internal threats. So looking at trends for how people are using the software, using the data, and identifying possible risks is a new item that's available from iManage called Threat Manager. And that is available, I believe, with all cloud subscriptions. So that's something that you can look at and you can set up to identify some possible risks. If there are key things that you're concerned about, some key things that we look at sometimes are the number of items are exported in a day or the number of documents accessed or viewed. It has some robust capabilities around looking at what your baseline is. So if you're somebody in a role that's constantly looking at large amounts of data, doing research, looking at those and accessing thousands of documents in a day, that may be normal. But somebody else who works in a very niche field, who's really only looking at a small amount of content, but spending a lot of time, drafting that content, and then suddenly there's a spike in their activity one day, that's when you look at identifying what might have happened there and having some kind of trigger. So really it's now the security paradigm change is protecting intruders from coming in. Now it's shifted to protecting your data from leaking out. So it's kind of, instead of from the outside in, it's the inside out. And that's where Threat Manager comes in to address some of those. So then moving on to authentication methods. Integration and reporting. A lot of different things change when you go to the cloud. You have to look at things like your workspace generation. There's likely some connection to a practice management, a time and billing, some type of way that you're kicking off your workspaces. That will differ in the types of firms, corporate or legal. There's some way that you need to look at that, and that connection now needs to be made to talk to the iManage cloud. There's generation utilities provided by iManage. There's third-party utilities that some of you may be using. So looking at whether those utilities need to be updated or if they are cloud compatible. So that's just a general consideration there. We touched briefly on the work client version. So if you are working with FileSite and DeskSite and you've got specific integrations that are assuming that those are still installed, and then you're maybe looking at moving to Work 10 Desktop, the COM-based integration is changing to REST-based. So depending on if you're keeping those clients, and this is again coming back to your thoughts on whether you're going to keep them and just introduce the web version, or you're going to completely upgrade to Work 10 Desktop and get rid of FileSite and DeskSite, that will have an impact on your integrations. And that's something that you really need to do a lot of testing and checking to make sure that before you go removing something that you actually are able to connect to it still. Office add-ins, making sure that those are checked. Compatibility, if you are upgrading to a new version, making sure that your version of Office is still compatible, and looking at, again, whether you're keeping the existing FileSite, DeskSite integration, classic integration, as iManage refers to it, or the new Work 10 Desktop integration. Third-party apps are a key thing. Looking at things like your comparison software, dictation software and review, department-specific applications, and then deeper into maybe IT or support utilities that you're using to access the content and then support your users. So those need to be considered as well. If there's something in there where there's just a name for the iManage server and some of them might use trusted login, as we saw in the, well, we'll see that in the next section. Actually, you're going to have to look at that trusted login section. It's no longer just a check mark in your trusted. We're looking at new ways of authenticating. So that's something that you probably have to look at each application, see if it is natively integrated, and if it is, if it's compatible with the cloud. In some cases, what we've seen with some comparison software, it may need to get a newer version of that software. So depending on if you're subscription-based or if you're up to date, you may need to get a cloud version of that same piece of software, because it may be integrated with iManage, but there might be an older version that you're using that doesn't have that cloud functionality yet. That's a key piece in there. Reporting methods. So looking at how you can report and how you can query content. So this is where the database admins that are used to having a whole package full of SQL queries to be able to look at, to analyze, and report on your database. A lot of those have to change now because of your inability to connect directly to the iManage database and run a query. So those need to look at having REST-based equivalents or looking at other tools that are REST enabled that you can use to query and look at different things. There are some basic items built into Control Center, some basic reports that you can look at there that are, directly accessing the cloud options and giving you data on that. And there are new tools that are coming on the market as well that are looking at reporting. So being able to look at and see how that's going to impact and what that's going to change. Other ways we can look at this as well from the reporting methods are if there is a requirement or a possibility of having that cloud data replicated somewhere. So this is something that Arbro has been focusing on for a little while now in a couple different ways. We've looked at, is there an option to have your whole database and your file store synced somewhere, either locally to a shared drive on your network, or possibly if you have other cloud storage that you're managing directly, you can have it synced there. And then that's going to give you some of those tools back again, where you do have a database you can access, where you can run queries on things like different usage reports and things like that. So that's some of those things you can look at. So if reporting is key, or if you have certain requirements around, still being able to have a copy of your data locally. I've actually heard some financial clients are okay with their data being hosted in the cloud, as long as there is a copy somewhere else. So there's different regulations around that as well. That's something that could be looked into and seeing if that's something that makes sense. And then getting into the last part, features and functions included with the cloud. So different options available. We talked a little bit about Security Policy Manager, Threat Manager. They're not cloud-only solutions. A lot of firms may have them running on-prem, but it is a lot easier to implement a lot of these with the cloud. Sometimes it's just a matter of flipping a switch because there's no servers to install. There's no integration points. They're natively integrated with the Work 10 environment. So being able to look at additional things like Drive, if you have OCR on the server, share. So those are three key things that are included with most of the cloud packages, depending on if you're corporate or legal. Their packages differ slightly. So being able to introduce these if they weren't already in your environment, or if they were, to make sure that they're set up the same way and configured to give you the same level of performance that you were looking at before. Drive is something that is brand new, that's coming out. Some of you may have been working with this in a test mode for a while now. So that's something I believe is released now, or is on the cusp of being released. And that will tie back into your client desktop solution as to whether you want to be able to have that kind of offline sync capability and possibly exposing certain content to iManage through the shared drive, through a drive letter. So that introduces some interesting things that could assist with integrations with some third-party apps. So if you have things that need to look at content from a shared drive perspective, there's some ways that might be able to assist. So generally, that's what we're looking at for integration and reporting, how things can change. There is ways of making most things work. It's just a matter of looking at specifically what you have configured and making sure that that's still going to work and there's a plan for it when you move to the cloud. Going to authentication methods. No more trusted login. I mentioned that that's something that is not as secure as required for the cloud. So looking at setting up a single sign-on or ADFS are something that is a piece that we see firms that already have it, just being able to use an existing server that has that set up on. Looking at certificates. If you're going to purchase a certificate from an authority on that, making sure you have the details correct as to how that's working. Sometimes there's two different types of certificates. They may just give you one and you need to figure out how to make the second one out of it. So there's some assistance on that part required in some cases. Or if you've been working with these types of things for a while now, this may be something that's very familiar. Other devices. Coming back to the actual client itself, if you are looking at Work10 Desktop or maybe enabling that on things like tablets and smartphones, being able to use either the app that's available through iOS devices or through the HTML5 web page, thinking about what that looks like from a device. Things like VPN if they're required, or you want to allow direct access. There are other options like two-factor authentication. If that's something that you're requiring on any mobile device. So all these pieces of information can come together, and it's just a matter of planning and understanding that it's probably not just a simple install and it's connected. You got to think about overall what your mobile device policy is and how this could now fit into that if you weren't already accessing iManage from these devices. And then access from anywhere. It opens up a lot of possibilities so that you may not necessarily have to be in from VPN to get the content. But if you are not needing that, and you're allowing access from other machines, looking at what that process looks like for checking out a document. It likely will change. There's not an integrated checkout path. The integrated checkout path does change the location when you are using the Work10 desktop. So it's not using the NR portable directory anymore. So we're just looking at managing if you have specific inclusions or exclusions for antivirus. If you're looking at having additional privileges for the user, on those directories, that will likely be something that you need to look into deeper when you're including Work10 Desktop for cloud. So I think that's it for authentication methods. One last piece here is knowing your data. So we'll dig into this a little deeper with the actual steps of how you can look at your data and analyze it and fix some issues before you actually move to the cloud in the next section. But overall, a couple key things we look at are your database integrity. So being able to look at all of the fields. So what iManage does when you're moving your content to the cloud through a migration utility is it's validating every field and every document as it goes. And if something is not matching or it's not what's expected, it will flag that and you'll have to go ahead and figure out what needs to be changed and fix that. So we try to minimize those number of items. But with the database itself, we see a myriad of things that could have happened over the years, whether you've just had iManage for decades and you've gone through so many DB upgrades and just overall some things gets possibly corrupted in that process. Third-party applications writing values directly to SQL tables. If iManage isn't aware of what that is or why it's there, it may flag those. And then looking at things like the file store integrity. Oftentimes, if you have documents that have been sitting there for 20 years or a long time that may have some integrity or corruption issues themselves, that's going to be noticed when you're actually moving it to the cloud, 0-byte files especially. And then we touched on a bit of version compatibility. There's a number of version items to check and look at, whether you're looking at the actual version of your iManage client, the iManage server, even the operating system that is running, and the SQL version of the SQL server. There's some interesting things that have come up recently with SQL 2017. If anybody's running those for their core iManage library, that's something that has to be looked at because we need to address that and either figure out some different methods for getting that content out, because I don't think directly that is going to be compatible. So we'll cover off a lot of those issues and more in our next section that we're going to have my colleague Arthi go through with you and talk about a pre-flight checklist. So I'll turn it over to you now, Arthi.
Thanks, John. So from those polls at the beginning of this presentation, it seems rightly so that data concerns are at the top of everyone's mind. The hope with this pre-flight checklist is to alleviate some of that concern by providing guidance on how you can best prepare prior to migration. So the first item to run is iManage's IMF check tool. So this tool will compile a list of documents that are missing in the file store, orphaned in the file store, or 0-byte files. So missing and 0-byte files will cause errors during the migration, and it's important to either clean them up prior to beginning or to take note of them so you're aware when they do. You would be able to use SQL to clear those out or create dummy files depending on what course of action you choose to take. The next item that is of concern are flat space documents. So one of the items with upgrading to the cloud is that flat space documents are no longer allowed and will be turned away by the iManage API during migration. So prior to running migrations, you would have to make a decision on how to clean up the database, whether it is to move them to a new to be filed workspace or create metadata for them and move them to the correct existing workspaces. We've had customers in the past who have had thousands of these documents and have undertaken smaller projects prior to beginning the cloud implementation to make sure these items are cleaned up. The next item is the folder tree check. So this is a utility provided by iManage that is a diagnostic tool to make sure that the tree structures of your workspaces and folders has been preserved. There are also scripts that do the same purpose, and we at Arbor do provide one that will run this check. It's an intensive script that needs to be run off hours and will let you know if there's any misaligned trees in the structure. We also have a fix script. The refolder tree also has a fix mode, which will clean up all of the issues that you find. This should be run during scheduled downtime. The next item to look at is to make sure that you have referential integrity. So the ID fields for the projects table and docmasters table are stored in the respective SID tables, projnumDB and docnumDB. You'll need to ensure that the values in these tables are higher than the max ID currently used. This rarely happens, but if it isn't, you'll have to figure out why that happened, whether it was a third-party integration gone wrong or some updates that didn't happen as expected, and then fix the issue to preserve that integrity going forward. The next item you would want to check are your workspaces. So one item to check with workspaces are whether they refer to non-existent document numbers in the docmaster table via SQL script. These are invalid entries and need to be removed prior to your migration. Another item that often causes problems are workspace shortcuts to workspaces that have been deleted. In previous versions of iManage, when a target workspace was deleted and a shortcut had existed to that workspace, the corresponding shortcut was not removed from the system. So when you're trying to migrate your data, the API is looking for a target that does not exist and will error out. We recently had a migration where there were over 2,000 of these items, which caused us a bit of a headache when we were running through our error troubleshooting because we weren't aware of them. So this has been added to the list to make sure that going forward, we are aware and take note of them so that we know how to handle them when they come up. The next items are user and group validations. These are a little bit more straightforward. First and foremost, you want to make sure that there aren't any duplicate users or groups or memberships, meaning that you don't want the same user to exist in a given group more than once. Again, this can be caused by rogue scripting or by third-party integrations that aren't quite working as they need to and need to be cleaned up prior to migration. Another issue could be user deletion. So if a user was improperly removed from the system, their user ID may not exist in the system, but might be on tables such as docmaster as the owner or operator. This usually happens when users have been removed improperly by way of deletion rather than using the approved rename functionality in iManage. So now we get to customizations. So in your database, you may have custom triggers or procedures, which will cause an issue if you choose to ship your database prior to using an API-based solution. When you ship your database, iManage needs to be able to restore the database into the cloud. And if these custom triggers exist, it will not be feasible, so they'll need to be removed. A bigger customization related influence I've seen are third-party utilities. So as I mentioned previously, some of these write directly to iManage tables, and as a result, they bypass a lot of the front-end precautions. So we've had many migration projects where there have been unwarranted leading or trailing spaces. There have been invalid date formats. So at one of my last migrations in the Project VPS table, there are actually a great number of dates that were missing one digit on the year, and all of the records would fail when migrating. So these are considerations that need to be made to make sure that they're working correctly, to try and fix them at the source so that we don't have to repeatedly correct them throughout the migration process. And last but not least, we have the biggest contributor to our migration problems, which is metadata. So as I mentioned, the greatest issue we've seen with metadata are leading and trailing spaces, but we've also seen blank values and missing lookup values in the Project VPS and DocMaster tables. So blank values are again usually caused by third-party integrations and either need to be removed or corrected before migration. Sorry, and another for the lookup values, it's important to make sure that they exist in their corresponding tables, because if they don't exist, again, they'll be thrown out and you'll have to go in and fix them manually. And duplicate values also exist. I've had a case with customers where they've had document classes which had misspellings. So there were some that had documents, and there were some that had documents spelt with the N and the T misplaced. So as a result, they had fixed them, but they had gotten rid of the previously incorrectly spelled value, but not changed all the documents. So during the migration, they were failing and they had to go back and fix them in migration. Whereas if we had found this earlier on, it would have been a much faster and easier approach during migration to fix them. So the items we covered here are just the most common causes of issues. We do have scripts that we run to check on all of our projects prior to migration to make sure that these situations don't arise, as well as the ability to fix them. We also provide these scripts with the purchase of our migration software, so they are available to anyone using them. And running these in advance will greatly reduce the amount of time and the amount of headaches you'll face during your migration project. And I'll pass it back to John to finish up.
Okay, thanks, Arthi. So a lot of different considerations for looking through the data and figuring out what needs to be fixed or what could be fixed to make it a lot smoother. And actually going to the cloud, looking at whether you can go directly, if everything's staying exactly the same where it is, if you have one main library and that's going to the cloud, that's something that could be done simply and easily through a lift and shift process. Other firms that are looking at maybe a more complex type of migration where you want to consolidate a bunch of regional libraries or other libraries first and then move that to the cloud. Generally speaking, it's a lot easier to do those types of manipulations before in an on-prem environment where there is access to SQL and the file store to do creative things, to merge libraries, to look through some of these issues, so that when you want to actually go to migrate to the cloud, it is a simple mirror process to go through, take everything exactly as it is and mirror it up, because the manipulation of the data on the cloud has different ways of working, so we're having to use REST APIs and things like that. So that's generally where that all comes together. So that's overall what we had to talk about today. I'll move on to the questions section to see if anybody has any questions that they've typed in, and we will answer those here. So if you have questions right now, if you can use the question section and type those in, we can go ahead and look at those. Someone was asking if we had the workspace check script. We can provide that if you contact us either through sales or support at arborosolutions.com. We can give you some of those items, and you can talk to us about that. In terms of access to the migration utilities itself, we sell those utilities directly, or if you're already working with an iManage partner, we do sell them to other partners as well and make them available. So it's not something that you have to use Arbro for your cloud migrations. We are supporting the partner community through this as well, and they would have access to purchase those, to use them directly. So they would be able to be trained up and use those products. Some of the pre-flight utilities that we mentioned, some are available from iManage, and some are some of the specific scripting we have created on our own to assist with our lift and shift solution. So some of them basically ask us if you have specific questions. iManage does provide a lot of them. You may have been aware of before, like the IMF check and things like that. Now, question about the length of time. How long does it take to do the migration? It's hard to say what is the average time because it's based on a lot of it, the size of the firm. For a single library migration from beginning to end, if you've been able to do that initial cleanup so that things are looking pretty good, best case scenario will be probably around 3 months to go through and look at planning, organizing, making sure the cloud's actually available, getting the availability date from iManage and working through that, planning it, testing it, and then being able to actually go live in there. A key part in the middle there is that testing. So I mentioned it briefly before, but in looking at what your expectations are, a lot of times people will have an expectation about what things will look like when they're in the cloud. So when you're making your migration plan, it's important to include some time in there, and we see this sometimes just from an IT perspective to make sure that, when you click on a document and it opens, does that amount of time acceptable? And then there's the user side of things where they're using things to go through their normal day-to-day processes to validate that they still work the same way with the data now being stored differently and possibly having your client piece change. So those are the key things to look at. Question is, let's see here. Would the existing ETL process have to be rewritten to work with REST calls as opposed to direct SQL integration? Possibly. I'd have to look into that a little deeper to see what that ETL process is and what it's actually doing and how it's making those calls. If it is depending on local INI files and library files that it's getting from file site and desk site to make that authentication, then those would probably need to be looked at to see if it could be using the new REST-based connection that iManage makes with the client. So there's a couple different considerations for that, depending on if you're keeping file site and desk site still installed and maybe just not actively used. Next question was, if your lift and shift tool does lift and shift of the database and documents, why must we use AV copy? So there's, getting into a little more technical side of this, there is some ways where certain sizes of data can be set up to use lift and shift directly. It used to be 4 terabytes, now I believe it's around 6. If you are under 6 terabytes, we can use lift and shift directly to not have to worry about doing any kinds of copies. We can directly set up a sync process to happen with your on-prem environment and the cloud, and there's no need to ship a disk to iManage. So a lot of the reason around that is why that time frame is in there, why we wouldn't go a lot larger. We had a recent client that had I think it was 64 terabyte, and they wanted to see if they could use lift and shift to do it. You just have to look at some of the general timeframes as to how long that would take. I think we calculated that to be about 4 to 5 weeks worth of time, just based on the throughput of the data going to the cloud. So it depends on that as well and how that part comes together. So I think we are getting short on time here, so let me make sure I get through, look through this. Who performs the testing? We see sometimes a 2-part test. Sometimes there's IT just to validate, is it accessible? Can I access things? Is it generally working, like a smoke test? And then there would be maybe a secondary or maybe the same type of testing that's involved by end users. Assistants that are heavy users, power users of iManage are great ones to test out what they typically do in this, but it's good to get a good cross section as well of the different types of people that may interact with it in different ways. Data transfer rate, I don't know if we have anything recent. Art, did you know what we might have as a baseline for data transfer rate using lift and shift? Okay, we may need to come back to that part there.
Sorry, I was muted, but it's about 20,000 documents per hour of our latest build.
Okay, perfect. So that's generally what we can see. There's obviously a lot of considerations in there with your network speed and distance and time to get content to the cloud. Delta process, yes. So there is a Delta process to go through that. And the last part here is QA testing, or part of the vendor engagement where the vendor will help the client do some validation. Depending on, we do have some possible ways that we could assist you with some of that validation there. I think we could possibly work with you to develop some scripts to test things out, some common things to look for to make sure that your cloud environment is working correctly. It will typically come down to your implementation partner and what they have and what they can use to do that. So I think we are out of time right now. If there's additional questions you'd have that you'd like us to discuss with you, you can contact us. We can either be contacted support@arbrosolutions.com or sales@arbrosolutions.com, and we can look through and direct your question to the appropriate person. As mentioned before, we will make this webinar available. We'll send you a link to it, and there will be a follow-up feedback form that we would really appreciate if you could fill out. So thanks a lot, everybody, for attending. We'll cut this off here, and if you have any other questions, please contact us. Thanks a lot.